Hey, welcome back to the Blue Cube. All right, so you've been into the operant conditioning stuff. You've been learning a little bit about Skinner. I think this is a little bit of my hangover from my history of psych course, but I really feel often like, again, knowing the context and knowing the people a little better can make the whole everything you're learning a little bit more interesting. And so I wanted to talk a little about Skinner per se, because Skinner is a major figure in psychology and had a huge influence at this time. And he's one of those interesting scientists that, yeah, they do their science thing, but they also, think about society, and they think about sort of bigger issues and bigger pictures. And as you'll see, they say some things that really make you think a little bit. So let's do that. Let's take a deeper dive into B.F. Skinner. Here we go. Come on. There we go. So just a couple of things, to get you thinking. And you'll see Skinner at various points in time here, but he is one of these guys that has these cool quotes. Failure is not always a mistake. It may simply be the best one can do under the circumstances. The real mistake is to stop trying. So I'm going to use these quotes to kind of try to make you understand Skinner better and behaviorism better and why it came to take the shape it did. And so what you see here with Skinner is his firm belief. Actually, let me back up. I'm going to back up before this. I want you to realize the following difference between operant conditioning and classical conditioning that we did previous. Classical conditioning was about, I'm actually going to put this slide backwards. I don't want you looking at that while I talk about this. Classical conditioning was about building on associations that already existed. So food makes the dog salivate. If something predicts the food, then they'll start to salivate to that thing too. Not quite the same salivation, the conditioned response instead. And so what have we done? We've added a bell to something that already existed, and we now made a response to the bell by connecting it with something that exists. Okay, where operant conditioning is different is it's not building necessarily on something that already exists. It's about consequences. So if we go back to this is how Skinner kind of thought about how we live. We find ourselves in various situations, surrounded by various stimuli, which he would call the stimulus complex, all of that stimuli that are around us. And we do something, we behave. And then that behavior is followed by consequences. Skinner thought, as implied by this quote, as long as we keep trying things, as long as we keep behaving, we will eventually fall into a way to behave that works. He almost saw this a lot like evolution theory itself, except it's the evolution of behavior. And so let me give you an example. Let's go back to the old version of a classroom. Let's imagine you were in a classroom, a pre-COVID classroom with a bunch of people, and the professor's going on, blah, 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 and they say something that you're not quite sure you understand. That's your stimulus complex. In a class, exposed to a lecture, the professor says something you don't understand. What do? And so this is an opportunity for you to behave. Maybe you decide, I'm going to raise my hand and I'm going to ask this person a question. I'm going to try to get clarification on what I'm confused about. And so you raise your hand, you ask your question, and the professor is going to respond. And there's two different ways. Well, there's a number of different ways the professor could respond, but two extreme ways. And one way is to show that they value your question. Oh, I'm glad you asked that. Other people are probably confused about that too. That gives me a second chance to kind of clarify, so let me do that. And if the professor does that, and especially if you now understand it, you've been rewarded for that behavior, which means, in Skinner's opinion, the next time when you're in that same sort of stimulus complex, that same situation, you're more likely to repeat that behavior. Now, if the professor instead says, my goodness, that's a stupid question, I really have to go back and explain that to you again, if they make you feel like an idiot for asking the question, well, shock, nobody's going to ask questions in the future. That would be the case of being punished, right, for that. So he thought we learned a lot like that. We go through life, we find ourselves in situations, we behave, and things happen. And he said quite often, the thing that happens turns out to be a negative consequence. You either get something bad added to your life or you lose something good. Both of those are not desirable states. And so he thought that's just part. So here, it's not a mistake. You didn't make a mistake acting that way. It might look like that afterwards because it led to something negative, but really that was you just trying out an option and learning. Okay, that wasn't a good option. Next time, I'm going to try something different. And Skinner thought if you continue to try different variants, different responses in a situation, you will ultimately find one that is, if you almost think of this in evolutionary terms, that enhances your reproductive success. That would be too extreme, but something that works in your world and gives you good stuff. That leads to positive outcomes. And so he thought that's what you had to do, is keep trying different things, and eventually your behavior would evolve. You would figure out the right way to respond in that situation. And so maybe in certain classes, the professor responds positively to questions, and in other classes, they don't. And so you would learn all of that. That's part of the stimulus complex. And you would ask questions in one situation and not ask them in the other. And so your behavior would start to evolve and be complex and be different in different situations, because as you go through this making a mistake and figuring it out, you're slowly getting more and more refined in terms of being able to produce behaviors that lead to positive outcomes. And so he really saw this, as how it's happening. And again, to get back to that point, we can put you in a brand new, that point about classical conditioning, we can put you in a brand new stimulus complex. Like maybe that was your first time in that class. You're not connecting with any past learning in a Skinner view. You're just in a situation, you respond, consequences happen. His 3-term contingency. And then learning can develop that way. Okay, so it's a kind of learning that can produce brand new responses to brand new stimuli. And remember, at the beginning of this, we were talking about learning as an explanation of how we come to have such a complex behavioral repertoire. How we behave so many different ways in so many different situations. Well, Skinner thought this learning process was critical for that. Okay, here's another one. Not exactly sure what he's getting at with this one, but I like it, even though it's a little pixelated. No one asks how to motivate a baby. A baby naturally explores everything it can get at unless restraining forces have already been at work. So if you don't start putting up baby gates and, locking cupboards and stuff, the baby will get in. And this tendency doesn't die out, it's wiped out. Very deep. So what Skinner's implying here is, almost like that previous one, we get in the world and we tend to behave, we tend to try things, we get out there and we do stuff, and that's our natural inclination. But sometimes some people who run into enough negative consequences, would probably be the story, stop trying. They stop exploring, and the fear of failure, the fear of mistake, the negative feelings that negative consequences can bring can sometimes demotivate somebody and get them to a point where they're not trying out things. And so overall, Skinner is trying to tell us here, don't be too worried about the mistakes. Don't be too worried about when things go wrong. I'm going to give you a Nelson Mandela quote here that I think fits really well. And Nelson Mandela said at one point, I never lose. He said, in any situation, I either win or I learn. That's the attitude Skinner would have. You're in a situation, you try something, it either turns out positive or you just had a powerful learning experience, which will help you get to a positive response next time. Either way, it's good. In a sense, even though it doesn't feel good. So that's what we're trying to, that's I think what he's getting at here is, we have to be a little more brave. We have to be out there. We have to try things. And only by trying things will we ultimately find the paths that work. And if we stop trying, then we just won't get there. Okay, so again, deep philosophical. This is what I like about Skinner. He's kind of like, whoa. Here's another one. I'm not going to quote you to death, but again, these are all great ways to kind of introduce Skinner a little bit. A person who has been punished is not less inclined to behave in a given way. At best, he learns how to avoid punishment. That's kind of interesting and kind of complex when you think about it. So he's saying, from a straightforward reading of operant conditioning, you would say, okay, if a behavior is followed by a negative consequence, it's less likely to occur in the future, right? And that's probably what it suggests clearly in the textbook. Skinner's saying, so this is the funny give and take of behaviorism. So we're going to start getting into this give and take. And what I mean by that is, the behaviorists would say, don't talk about consciousness, memory, things you can't measure. What you can measure is behavior, right? How do they behave in the stimulus context? And what you can clearly say is that if a negative consequence happens, then that behavior is less likely. Okay, so from a clearly behaviorist point of view, that's all you can say. But what this reveals is Skinner thinks there's a little more going on than that, though. Even though they don't study it scientifically, he's suggesting that this person who behaved that way and ended up being punished for it, it's not necessarily they'll just say, oh, I'll be less likely to do that in the future. They may be a little more, okay, I still want to do that, but I'm going to have to be a little more careful about when and how I do that, because if I do that the way I just did, I'm going to get punished. So he's saying it's not really like you're reducing the likelihood that they'll behave that way. You're reducing the likelihood they'll behave that way in that context, because the context signals consequences. But if they find a slightly different context where they think the consequences might be different, they will still behave the way they want. Okay, very complicated. But this brings me to the distinction of something called a discriminative stimulus. And I have a story about my first dog that I like for the discriminative stimulus thing. And here's the story. When we had the first dog, I was a young kid. My dad was the person who disciplined the dog and who worried about all the kind of dog stuff. And my dad had a rule. The rule was the dog is not allowed to go on the furniture. The dog stays on the floor. And my dog was named Max at this time. Okay, cool. Now, what would, if Max was ever on the furniture while Dad was present, Max was Maxine, actually, she would get punished in some way. Dad would yell at her, tell her to get off the furniture, and make her feel bad, which you can make a dog feel bad. They'll feel guilty, go away. And so Dad would do that. But what we noticed is a couple things. First of all, anytime we left, as we opened the door, we thought we could hear her jumping off furniture. And in fact, if you went to any of the, where we thought she was laying, you could feel that it was warm and she'd been laying there when we weren't there. Another example, if I got up early Saturday morning, which I typically did to watch cartoons or whatever, and my parents weren't up yet, she would come down and she would kind of look at me and look at the furniture and look at me, and then ultimately she would go up on the furniture. And it was kind of like, what are you going to do about it, buddy? You going to do anything about it? And she'd go on the furniture, and I didn't do anything about it. I didn't care. I didn't tell her to get off. I didn't yell at her. And so she would quickly learn, she can be on the furniture while I'm down there. But as soon as she heard Mom and Dad get up, poof, off the furniture. Okay, so what is going on here? My dad is becoming what's called a discriminative stimulus. And a discriminative stimulus is one that signals a change in the consequences, or a change in what we sometimes call the reward contingencies. And so basically, when Dad is present, that tells her, if I get on the couch, I get punished. When Dad is absent, she thinks, if I get on the couch, I get rewarded, because she gets rewarded by the warmth and the cuddliness of the couch and probably the ability to see things from a slightly higher thing. And so, this is why we talk about the stimulus complex, that it contains things that ultimately become connected to the consequences and signal the consequences and actually tell this entity what will happen if they do certain things. And so it's not that she, by being punished, is less inclined to jump on the couch. She's just gotten a little smarter. She's like, I'm going to jump on the couch when I'm not going to get punished for it. And she's learned that. Okay. So I think that's really kind of an important, interesting aspect here that he's highlighting with this quote. And the craziest looking Skinner, but the quote I absolutely love, and it's kind of fascinating from a behaviorist. Education is what survives when what has been learned has been forgotten. Skinner was a big deal. He also said things like, we shouldn't be teaching our students the classics, the classic books. We should be teaching them to love reading. So what's he saying there? So he was very interested in education. And what he was interested in was the sort of habits of mind that education can produce. That it can make you, for example, a better critical thinker. You know, if somebody presents some information to you after learning a little bit about science, let's say, you can say, hey, hang on, do I believe that or not? He thought that's education. You know, not the original example that you worked through to figure out the critical thinking, but the effect it had on your mind, the change it had on you in terms of your motivation and stuff. And so it's kind of interesting because behaviorists don't usually talk about the mind, right? Or memory or attention. But the way he thinks of education is kind of like that. It's these cognitive changes that we make in an individual as they go through an educational process. You know, for me, this links up to what I now call the development of transversal skills, that I'm trying to teach you how to think creatively and critically and communicate and all those sorts of things. That's what he thought education did, that it gave you this new set of cognitive abilities that changed the way you interacted with the world. And that was what was important about it, more important than what you actually learned. So I like that quote. I think it's very cool, and I like this crazy looking Skinner guy. Let me actually mention here too another little sort of fun Skinner thing before we get into some of why he had the influence he had. He also wrote a book called Walden 2. That if you want something interesting to read, I would recommend it. It is what we call a utopian novel. So after World War II. And after, basically so many people witnessed human beings just, like doing horrible things to one another, dropping bombs on cities and, chemical weapons and all this stuff. When people really understood the horror of war and the stupidity of war to some extent, they started to think, you know what, we're not doing things right. Our society is not set up properly. Humans should not be having war on one another like this. Can we imagine a world that was set up differently? And so these are called utopian novels, where people try to describe a way of existing, a societal kind of model that they think would lead to more peace and harmony in the world. And Walden 2 is one of those. And what he does is he takes all the principles of behaviorism and he imagines a world where people are rewarded or punished or whatever in the right way, in a way that would make for a harmonious existence for all. It's a high goal to reach. But again, it kind of shows you that for him, this wasn't just, data. It was more, and he like many people wanted to make a positive impact on the world. So kind of interesting that way. All right. So now just some sort of quick other things that attach with what you've been reading. So why was Skinner as famous as he was? Part of it is he's obviously a deep thinker, but he was also a very clever experimentalist. And in fact, it's some of his innovations, quite honestly, that made behaviorism the strong, powerful force it was, and that drew so many new young scientists to it. So let's talk about some of those. And I want to highlight these two. The first is the one on the left. It's called a Skinner box or an operant chamber, if for those who don't want to actually stick Skinner's name on it. But what did he do here? He built a sort of mini universe. So this is where rat psychology comes to be rat psychology, because Skinner believed that the core principles of learning are present in all species. And so we could study any species. We could use any species to study learning, and what we learn from that research applies to all life forms. So that was his belief, and so that's why he started thinking rats were a great subject to use. People don't tend to like rats very much from an ethical perspective. It's an easy one to use. But then what he wanted to do was basically create an artificial world, a very stripped down world, but one that had the things necessary to study a behaviorist kind of thing. So specifically, remember the stimulus complex? It has certain ways of presenting stimulation to the rat. A speaker for sound, maybe a couple of lights, where a light could signal something. Remember my dad being present or absent? Well, maybe a red light on is a discriminative stimulus or something like that. So he's got some ways of presenting sound and light. He's got a thing the rat can use to behave, to respond. And in fact, he ultimately ends up saying, this is the response I care about. Obviously a rat can walk around and stand on its hind legs and scratch its ears and do a whole bunch of things, but I care about when it presses this bar. And we'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. But that was his way for the rat to behave. And then there had to be consequences of the behavior. One of the consequences was a food hopper that would deliver food occasionally. And so that's the ability to reward the rat if you want to reward it for some reason. And then look at this electric grid 2-shock generator. They could electrify the floor as a means of punishment, positive punishment, as the way your textbook describes it. A word here that, yes, this is back to Ghostbusters. The beginning of Ghostbusters kind of has this. There was a time in psychology when electricity was used quite often as a punishing stimulus. It was seen as a interesting one or useful one because it doesn't actually cause any real damage, at least at the voltages that were used, but everybody hates it. Every animal in existence hates the feeling of electricity and recoils from it. And so it has a real negative emotional reaction. We have a negative emotional reaction to it, but it's not really all that damaging. And so it was seen as a very powerful, positive punishment stimulus. Okay. And so the claim is this is sort of like a little world that the rat lives in where we can train them to do things. So for example, first of all, just training them to press the bar. Now you might, you'd put the rat in there and you would just sort of often just let it do its thing. And if you leave it in there long enough, and especially if it's hungry. So by the way, they used to always keep rats at something like 80% of their natural body weight. So if you let them eat all they wanted, they would get to a certain weight, but they would now restrict the food intake until that rat was about 80% of its desired weight, which essentially means the rat is hungry. And in behaviorist terms, they would call that motivated to learn or motivated to get rewards. Is that horribly unethical? I'll let you guys kind of think about your own ethical stance on this kind of stuff. But that's how they would do it. And so the claim is there's this hungry rat, and he would probably just explore this universe. It's not a very big universe. And so sooner or later, he's going to be mucking around over here, and maybe he'll accidentally touch this bar or whatever. But when he does, suddenly a little food pellet comes down. And he's hungry. He's like, oh, that's great. But then, in this way that animals are looking for causal relationships, it's what we imagine. He's kind of like, wow, where'd that come from? Why did I get that? How did that happen? Well, I was over here somewhere. And so this is a little bit of that, effect of a positive thing. They're more likely to kind of engage in behaviors they were doing just before the reward. So maybe he mucks around over here and then accidentally touches it again and food comes down. And the claim is before too long, he will see the connection and he will just press the bar and the food comes down, press the bar and food comes down. You now have a trained rat, a rat that knows how to earn rewards. But now you can go ahead and do things like, well, we could get back to the dad experiment. So we could say, okay, once you've been trained, now we're going to bring these lights into play. And when the red light's on, if you press the bar, you get food. Okay, that's like my dog going on the couch. If the blue light's on and you press the bar, you get an electric shock. The animal will quickly learn that contingency. It won't press the bar if neither light's on. So maybe you say if neither light's on and he presses the bar, nothing happens. Okay, so he'll learn that, right? He'll habituate. He won't press the bar when there's no one on. When the red light's on, he will come and press it and get food. When the blue light's on, he'll quickly learn not to come anywhere near that bar. And so we have a discriminative stimulus. We've modeled my dog's existence in a sort using this little virtual universe, so to speak. The other kind of interesting thing he did is he took this little bar press thing and he hooked it to, you just ever see those things when they show earthquakes where needles are going back and forth and a sheet of paper is rolling. It's sort of the same idea. You have a drum rolling a sheet of paper here, but now what it would do is there'd be a pen on this, and the roll would keep going at a certain rate, but every time he clicks that bar, the pen moves up this way, and then it stays there until he clicks the bar again, then goes, and it stays there. So every step in this is a response by the animal. And so what this does, and this is the draw of behaviorism. This was the draw of behaviorism. Psychology, soft science, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not a soft science, not in this way. Look, we can record every behavior precisely, and we can have this beautiful readout that shows us how the rat was behaving. How often did he press the bar, at what rate? And so we can see points where he's not responding very well. We can see points where he's pretty aggressively responding, pressing it quite often. This is a sort of blip. He just sort of stops for some reason here for a while. And so you can get a real clear measurement of behavior through this cumulative response, which allows you to do things like this, okay, to connect it back to that reward contingency thing. Remember, you learned a little bit about fixed intervals versus fixed ratio. So a fixed interval says as long as he's responding at some time, so every minute or every more like 10 seconds, every 10 seconds or every 20 seconds, we check to see if he's responding. And if he was responding, he gets a reward at that point, as long as he's responding at that point. And one of the things you see from this cumulative record is he starts to learn this. He starts to realize, okay, I get it after every 10 seconds. And so now when he gets a reward here, he's kind of like, okay, I can wait for a while now. Because if I respond here, I never get one just after I got one. So why bother? I won't bother for a while. But then once he starts getting to the point where he thinks the reward might be coming, then he picks up his response. And he wants to make sure that when that next reinforcement comes, he is responding. And then he gets his thing. So you see this shape. Here's one where it's a fixed ratio. So every time he does, say, 10 responses, he gets a reward. And then another 10 responses and he gets a reward. And we once again see him take a little break after he gets a reward. But you can say things like, look, the break isn't as long. And look, the rate of growth is so much stronger with the fixed ratio. What's he doing here, by the way? Let's say it's 10 presses and he's going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And he's eating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So he's just kind of, riff them off. Whereas in this condition, it's kind of like, okay, somewhere, I don't know, I'm probably not quite, okay, we're somewhere around here, I'm going to get rewarded if I'm responding. So he kind of picks it up right when he's around that interval, when he gets responded. The bigger picture here is we can now look at things like, how does the way an animal is rewarded or punished change the way it behaves? And we can look at that in very precise, objective ways. And so that's what behaviorism was, sort of, halfway through the life of psychology. It started in around the 1900s, late 1800s, about halfway to today. There was a lot of people doing all sorts of different stuff, including clinical psychology. There was all this emphasis on nature, and here we have the behaviorists saying, no, we're going to look at nurture, and we're going to study it in the most scientific way psychology has ever studied anything. And it's a very important thing to study. And so suddenly a lot of people were drawn to behaviorism, and it was in part because Skinner came up with these clear devices, apparatus, for both manipulating the environment and reward contingencies and measuring behavior that came out of it. So his innovative mindset really made him the powerful force he was in this area. Okay. Last thing I want to say about Skinner to get you thinking, and I keep reconnecting this stuff to consciousness every now and then because I think consciousness is the really interesting, the crown jewel of psychology. If we could understand consciousness, that would be something. So I like, to drag you through what we think of it as we go. And Skinner, and remember, by the way, behaviorism was before a lot of the studies I told you about in chapter 6. But Skinner had this view. So this is funny. This was him responding to a question as AI was starting to be a thing in his day, in the sort of 60s and 70s, when there started to be this notion of robots and AI, and could you ever create an artificial form of intelligence? And his answer is, hey, listen, the real problem is not whether machines think or could be made to think, but whether men do. Men being a sign of the times, obviously. But he's challenging conscious thought in humans. And when he was pushed on this a lot more, this is what Skinner said. We find ourselves in situations and we behave in certain ways. That behavior is almost always, if not always, a reflection of our reward history. We've been in situations like this before, we've behaved before, we've been punished for some things, we've been rewarded for other things, and eventually we have evolved a way of responding, a habitual way of responding, just based on the rewards and punishments. And so next time we're in that situation, we just behave a certain way. If somebody said, why did you do that? Okay, now they're talking to your consciousness. And you will give them a reason. But you probably won't say, oh, it's because I was rewarded 3 times for doing this and punished 5 times for doing that. You don't think of your reward history at all. You come up with some other reason. Oh, I didn't sleep very well last night, and I guess that's why I kind of responded negatively to that person or whatnot. Consciousness, Skinner thought, likes to tell us stories about why we behave the way we do. Remember the split brain stuff? It tells us stories so that we can kind of understand our behavior ourselves and explain it to others. But Skinner thought those stories were bullcrap, that they just were not true. And in fact, he said the following. He said, consciousness is epiphenomenal. What is epiphenomenal? An epiphenomenon is a phenomenon that occurs but has no causal power. So let me give you a sense. If you run a car engine, there are magnetics in most engines. Magnets, not magnetics. Magnets in most engines. And when the engine runs, it generates a magnetic field. And you can measure that. That magnetic field is there. It is present. It is absolutely there and real. But it doesn't change the functioning of the engine in any way. It just emerges from the functioning of the engine. It has no causal effect on how the engine works. It is just an emergent phenomenon. And that's what Skinner thought consciousness was, human consciousness. He thought there was the machinery, and the machinery of learning and the machinery of behavior was not consciously driven. It was driven by processes that continually adjust your behavior based on the outcomes, the consequences. And you're not aware of any of that going on. Consciousness exists. He thinks this machine that is our mind generates this thing called consciousness, and it's real, but it doesn't affect the machine. He thought it had no real power to change the way we behave. He thought it was just epiphenomenal, and it's just what we use to explain ourselves to ourselves and to others. I don't completely buy this, and I've implied as much to you, that I think there are situations, especially brand new novel situations, especially complex novel situations. So for example, learning to swing a baseball bat at a ball. This is kind of a weird, people throw you a ball and you swing a bat at it, and if you've never swung a bat, you don't even really understand the motor mechanics of doing it. And so that's the kind of case, I think, where your consciousness says, can I watch you do it? Can you tell me how to do it? And then we try to guide our behavior using our consciousness to get close to what we're supposed to do. At some point, we probably just stop and let the sort of Skinnerian process take over. So once we're sort of close to hitting a ball, then we just give it our best go, and then there are low-level processes based on our successes or failures that shape our behavior and refine it. But originally, to get that going, I think you need conscious processes to do that. But again, this challenging idea, one of the brightest minds in psychology questioned whether human consciousness plays any role in our behavior. Here's a big one. All right, I'm going to leave you with that big thought. I'm going to have another lecture coming up where we will get at those reward contingencies a little bit more in the context of your addiction to your cell phone. Remember that. We're going to come back to that next. See you there.